It's January 29th, 1942, and another remarkable event is about to be uncovered by Arion, Rebecca, and Olly, the Retrospectors.
Few people tuned into their radios today in history in 1942 could have known that they were hearing the birth of what would become the longest-running music radio program in the world, the first ever episode of the BBC's Desert Island Discs.
Yeah, first the audience would have heard the programme's theme music, the one that's still in use today. Beautiful.
I don't know if that's recognisably By the Sleepy Lagoon, composed in 1930 by Eric Coates. It's my best effort.
Everyone will be shouting at their phones right now. And interestingly, not designed to evoke an idyllic tropical island, but the Sussex seaside resort of Bognor Regis. The audience would then have heard the host, Roy Plomley, explain the premise of the show, because of course this was the first episode. He told listeners they were listening to, quote, a programme in which a well-known person is asked the question, if you were to be cast away alone on a desert island, which 8 gramophone records would you choose to have with you? Assuming, of course, that you had a gramophone and an inexhaustible supply of needles.
I mean, it is extraordinary that man, Roy Plomley, you'll know his name if you still listen to Desert Island Disc, because of course he's thanked in the credits of every edition as the creator of the show, continued to present it until his death in 1985, a total of 1,786 editions. And the format is still basically the same. Each week a new castaway asked to name 8 tracks of music that he or she would choose to be marooned with. Later, though, came the book, and, of course, the business about you get the Bible or its equivalent and the complete works of Shakespeare. And the last format innovation was in 1951 when the luxury item arrived. The guest then, Sally Ann Howes, the actress, chose a garlic plant.
The way that Plomley came up with this format that is so enduring is quite interesting. Between mid-1937 and mid-1939, Plomley was actually working between France and London. And during this period, he was presenting a variety program called Radio Normandy Calling. It was actually recorded on location in theatres at UK seaside resorts, and it actually outperformed the BBC in terms of its audience ratings. But this stage of his career came to a pretty abrupt halt when commercial broadcasting from continental Europe just came to an end altogether with the outbreak of World War II. And Plomley and his then new wife, Diana Wong, whom he had married a year earlier, they stayed in Paris, but they only narrowly escaped back to the UK. They fled by this convoluted route that took them through France. They had to lose all their possessions as the German forces neared Paris.
No, really?
In June 1914.
Which one did they choose to save from the fire?
Oh, good question. Which records did he go with? But then just over a year later, he had this ingenious idea, which came to him spontaneously one evening at home, and he subsequently wrote to Leslie Perrone, who oversaw popular record programs at the BBC, and Perrone thought this sounds like a good idea and commissioned it pretty much immediately.
Yeah, Perrone himself would later become the first ever guest host in May 1942 when Plomley himself was a castaway. I feel like they were running through the novelty twists on the format a bit early. They didn't realise how long this was going to go on for. But there was a reason that Perrone was so keen to commission this. He originally commissioned 8 episodes, obviously, about 1,700 and something short of the current running title. But the reason was that the BBC really needed some jazzy programming for its wartime lineup. Basically, before the war, there had been 2 BBC radio services, the national programme and the regional programme. But on the eve of World War II, these were combined into a single national station called the Home Service, partly to avoid the Luftwaffe using the regional transmitter signals as navigational guidelines. So the Home Service was mostly made up of news and educational programming. It was the forerunner of Radio 4. And the music was classical, or at least not very trendy. To give you a notion, gaps in the schedule were often filled with several continuous hours of organ music. And even before the war, many listeners who were within range of the French coast preferred things like Radio Luxembourg, Radio Normandy. The latter, despite its name, was owned by a Tory MP. That's the station that Plomley had been broadcasting for. And so he was familiar to millions of households, particularly in southern England. And that was more popular commercial programming. And unlike the staid BBC of the 1930s, it broadcast on Sunday mornings as well. And so the coming of the war and the negative reaction to the Home Service, especially among service personnel, convinced the BBC they needed a second station, something jollier, more morale boosting. This became the Forces programme, and it featured more popular music, more light entertainment, quiz shows, call-in shows, comedies, sitcoms, and now Desert Island Discs.
And also, someone of their age, of the listeners who are listening to Forces Radio. He was 27, Roy Plomley, when he was presenting this show. I know that he sounds obviously like a 60-year-old man, because every broadcaster sounded like a 60-year-old man in 1942. But the audience would have known that he was in his 20s and he was more like them. And the whole thing felt fresh and casual compared to the kind of thing that the BBC used to broadcast. And again, that wartime context, I think, helps make sense of what Desert Island meant as a metaphor for the broader audience listening at home as well. It's interesting, isn't it? Now, Desert Island suggests insalubriousness and lack of luxuries. You're kind of thinking like, oh, so I only get a playlist of 8 records. That is a restriction on my life. But then, to a wartime audience being blitzed at home by the Germans, the idea of like a warm and bounteous island was a fun counterpoint to the crippling self-sufficiency that the country was trying to cope with during ration time. So this was escapism. Imagine you're on a fun Caribbean island.
Yeah, exactly. And the first episode featured Vic Oliver, who was a popular light entertainer and comedian. And his selection of records was much more about like humor and fun and enjoyment than it was about, kind of what Desert Island Discs has become today, which is an exploration.
Tell me about your difficult childhood
and their career.
Tell me about your dad.
Difficult childhood.
Oh, you went to boarding school, did you? Did they beat you?
I mean, even so, there was a little bit of, it was mostly fantasy escape. This was meant to be a beautiful desert island with all the guavas you could eat, presumably. But there was also a bit of like psychological test in there, a way of kind of stripping a person down to their essentials. And even in its earliest incarnation, you still had that balance of entertainment with introspection, which allowed the person who was being interviewed, the castaway, to think about who they were, what they were at their barest essence, and what they couldn't live without.
Yeah, although not so much in these early episodes, because during the war, all programming for BBC Radio was scripted, and the scripts were carefully examined by BBC censors, so you weren't going to get lots of spontaneous insight into the psyche of the guest.
It really was identified mainly with my German ancestry, no one said.
And also, the other way that you can see the impact of the war is when you look at the guest list in those early episodes too. Arthur Askey, Ivan Novello, Leslie Howard, West End performers, or BBC radio stars, basically reflecting who they could get to the BBC's Maida Vale studios during World War II, and basically people who were already in London.
Yes, but obviously the show evolved into what it has become, which is, I think, the greatest interview programme ever made. It is the most reliably brilliant kind of insight into individual guests, I think, and that's why it's the longest running show in history, apart from the Grand Ole Opry. And if you try and work out what the secret sauce is, I think it is simply that the guest has done some preparation for a very particular kind of interview, which is different to everything else that they do, because they are being asked to supply the show with the key that unlocks a highly emotionally charged or nostalgic moment for them. The moment that otherwise would take a production team hours of research to unlock, or a persistent interviewer, a lot of difficult questions to get to. They come with it. This is the song that reminds me of when I was in the 6th form. Oh, what happened to you there? And you're immediately in that story in the way that only music connects with people, and does so universally.
Yeah, and gives people the opportunity to introduce a record that the radio station also wants to spin. So you've got this kind of ready-made best hits that are being introduced by a different interesting person each week. And it's funny to look through the most popular picks through the years. At the top of the list, it's the Beatles, followed by Frank Sinatra, Bob Marley, David Bowie, Joni Mitchell, and Nina Simone. So you have this kind of arrival of new popular music to go with the stuff that has been popular forever. The most chosen piece of music is Handel's Messiah. That's been selected by 119 of the show's guests.
Some moments that stick out to me: the people who choose their own records as their records. Yes. Dame Elizabeth Schwarzkopf chose 8 tracks, which were all recordings of her own voice. Rolf Harris also chose 3 of his own records. And Engelbert Humperdinck, as a choice of book, chose his own autobiography.
Just in case you forgot.
Surely Your Memories is the only thing you've got with you on a desert island. Anyone else's book. would provide some variety.
Maybe it was ghost written and it was a particularly fabulous evocation of his life. I found the same, actually. Pianist Moira Limpany, she did the same as Schwarzkopf by choosing all 8 of her own recordings during her appearance in 1979.
Do you know what? I am willing to excuse Schwarzkopf and Limpany here because I think actually they probably just slightly misunderstood the point of the show. I think to them, these are special moments. You know, these were concert pianists, vocalists. You know, these were the highlights of their career that maybe they wanted to relive forever and ever on the desert island. But again, you'd think somebody would just have a quiet word in their ear and say, most people tend to pick the Beatles.
Yeah, there's a thing that I suspect means that Lauren Bacall had never heard the show before she agreed to appear, which is at the end when Plomley asks which of the records would you save from the waves, she was insulted by the question. So he's signing off from the show saying, thank you for letting us hear your Desert Island discs. And she pipes up in the background with, and thank you for taking 7 of them away from me.
I think one unique episode, apart from, of course, all the early ones that no one will ever get to hear because they weren't saved, was that in the 1970s there was an infamous unbroadcast episode after the show booked, or so they thought, Alistair MacLean, author of The Guns of Navarone, but they had actually booked Alistair MacLean, the European chief of Ontario's tourist board.
Oh no!
He arrived at the studio. He was happy. It was like, you remember that BBC news
Guy
interview
Gomi.
with the
We're going to get to it one
guy?
day, inevitably.
Yeah. Plumley realised the error just before the interview began, presumably during the warm-up chit-chat, when he said, how was it writing The Guns of Navarone? And he said, have you ever been to Ontario? But they gamely carried on. This is what I like. They were polite, you know. It wasn't being broadcast live at this point, so they could have turned him away. But to be polite, they allowed him to stay. They did the episode. Of course, it was never broadcast, but I mean, hopefully they gave him a copy to play for friends and family at home.
I mean, sort of the ideal way to be on Desert Island Discs, isn't it? Actually getting the interview, but no one having to listen to it. Do you know what I mean? Like having a record that you can play to your actual friends of what your life was like without having the embarrassment of everyone judging it.
If I had to take one track with me to a desert island, it would have to be my episode of Desert Island Discs.
To hear more from us on this topic, join Club Retrospectors now. Unlock our weekly bonus bits at patreon.com/retrospectors.